To his left is Professor Andre Douglas Pond Cummings. He is the founding Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Law at Indiana Tech University School of Law. Prior to that, he spent 9 years at the West Virginia University College of Law. His scholarship spans a number of areas. He is an expert not only in investment protection and corporate law, but he has also written extensively on race, affirmative action, and social justice, as well as matters of sports and entertainment law. He is currently working on a book entitled Corporate Justice, which is coming out this fall.
I'm delighted to be here today. I wanted to just thank quickly Christian Johnson for organizing this panel. He is a leading national and even international expert in derivatives and financial markets law. It's great for the University of Utah, I think, for him to be here, and I'm grateful to him for organizing the panel today, and for the Quinney College of Law for hosting us. And also, other than having just met Kern Alexander for the first time, I am good friends with all of the individuals on the panel, and so that always makes things even better. My topic today: Austerity Bites, Communities of Color and the Impact of Spending Cuts. My topic is based largely on two recent articles I've written, one called Racial Coding and the Financial Market Crisis, which was published in the Utah Law Review here just last year. The other article is called Families of Color in Crisis, the Crushing Weight of the Financial Market Meltdown. That was published in the Howard Law Journal last year as well, and I'm happy to share those articles or cites to them with any of you that are interested. Okay, so several times this audience, which has been very impressive, has pushed our economists in the debate last night and in the panel this morning on inequality. And I think it's fair to say, no offense, but I think it's fair to say that our economists struggled with that question when asked about inequality and what austerity means for wealth gaps and inequality gaps in our country. The financial market crisis of 2008, the mortgage meltdown, landed heaviest and hardest upon communities of color. In the communities of color that bore, and I argue continue to bear, the weight of the crisis, women of color were by far the most affected by the mortgage meltdown. In an ultimate irony, in my view, many economists, most I would say, scholars and commentators now agree that the financial market collapse of 2008 was caused primarily by a select group of elite privileged white men, i.e. Wall Street executives, mortgage lenders, and politicians. However, the impact of Wall Street's fascination with securitizing subprime mortgages, creating worthless collateralized debt obligations, and then trading these unregulated exotic instruments recklessly, the result of that has been a government bailout, absolution of these Wall Street banks by the media, America's leaders and politicians, and a global citizenry that I believe is still adrift, with no Main Street bailouts in sight, instead dealing with austerity now. The mortgage crisis of 2008 disproportionately had a harsh impact on minority families and homeowners. Minority medium wealth plummeted in light or in the aftermath of the financial market meltdown. In 2009, this Pew Research report came out showing the relative net worth of families and the devastating inequality gap that continues to persist. You'll see in 2009 that the net worth of white households was $113,000. The net worth of Hispanic households in 2009 was $6,000. That was down from $18,000 prior to the mortgage meltdown. African American families' median wealth is $5,677 in 2009, down from $12,000. You can see how the market crisis impacted Hispanic and black medium wealth. This precipitous drop can be attributed to the fact that a lot of minority wealth is tied up in home ownership and home equity, thus making minority communities extremely vulnerable to the type of housing crises that we saw in 2008. Contrarily, whites are often better able to diversify assets from their home equity and home value into stocks, bonds, retirement, and other investment alternatives. So the housing crisis only widened the existing wealth gap, which even in 2005 was extraordinarily bad. And this is a nightmarish problem that continues in the United States, wealth by race. Women of color. In minority communities that were devastated by the financial market crisis, women of color emerged the most harshly impacted. Emerging evidence confirms that women of color were disproportionately foreclosed upon, based primarily on the disproportionate number that were steered into subprime mortgage loans based on devious predatory lending. One report indicates that African American women were 256% more likely to be offered a subprime loan than was a white male. Recent studies further indicate that women of color received significantly higher interest rates than white men on precisely the same loan terms and credit scores. I have all of the citations if you're interested in seeing that evidence. Unemployment continues to devastate urban city centers, and women of color are facing joblessness at rates significantly more injurious than are white males. The impact of this reality on minority families has been devastating. Well, that's the impact in a snapshot of the mortgage crisis, but let's fast forward 4 years. The racial wealth gap has widened. African Americans, the wealth of African Americans is now even less than it was in 2009, and Hispanics is static. And the racial wealth gap now in 2012 remains just as devastating. Today, March 1st, 2013, deep spending cuts will begin to be implemented as we enter the sequester or the sequestration. And the question that I am really interested in trying to address today is, upon whom will these consequences fall most harshly? Well, I posit that these cuts will not be felt severely by bankers, Wall Street executives, politicians, or white families. I posit that minority workers and those already under the most economic stress will feel the weight of these cuts more than any other. Okay, so let's talk about assets and dependence upon government assistance. Based on the wealth gap that we just talked about, with fewer assets to fall back on in hard times, African American and Latino families rely more heavily on unemployment insurance, Social Security, and public assistance in times of need. For example, as this chart shows, over half of older African Americans and half of Latinos depend on Social Security for more than 90% of their family income. So that's the chart there, the 90%, that shows how much more African American and Latinos rely on Social Security for more than 90% of their income than maybe 35% of white families. Cuts in unemployment, cuts in Social Security, or cuts in its public assistance programs will most definitely fall disproportionately on minority communities. What about government and public sector jobs? Unemployment today, 15.8% in the African American community, 11% in the Hispanic community, just 7.9% in the white community. And of course, these unemployment statistics don't take into account those that have quit looking for work. And so we can expect that these unemployment figures are even higher than what's reported here. African Americans will be disproportionately, and Latinos, affected by cuts in public sector workers and furloughs of federal employees. And that's probably what newspaper reports are indicated are going to be felt first. Governmental employees being furloughed. Well, 30%, African Americans are 30% more likely than the overall workforce to work in public sector jobs. Here I'm talking about teachers, social workers, bus drivers, public health inspectors, and other valuable roles. In fact, African Americans are more than 70% more likely to work in federal government jobs than are white workers. Public sector jobs have also provided, historically, African American and Latino workers the opportunity for better opportunities and professional advancement. So of course, if furloughing federal government workers is one of the austerity steps that we're going to take, it will disproportionately impact African American and Latino workers. The percentages of African Americans are highest in those agencies that are most often targeted for cuts. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, 38% of workers are African American. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, 42% are African American workers. And in the Education Department, 36% are African American workers. And those are the agencies that are often on the chopping block when it comes to austerity or cutting jobs. What about cuts in programs for the poor? The beneficiaries of programs meant to assist the poor are again disproportionately African American and Hispanic. In 2009, according to census data, 51% of African American households and 53% of Hispanic households receive some form of means-tested government assistance, including food stamps and public housing. Only 20% of white families relied on some form of means-tested government assistance. So once again, spending cuts in those areas are going to fall disproportionately upon minority citizens in the United States. The haves versus the have-nots. This is a quote from Dave Armstrong, a reporter from Wellington, New Zealand, in the Dominion Post. He said, quote, "The trouble with people who preach austerity is that they rarely practice it themselves. We expect the poor to live an austere lifestyle, but everyone else can spend up large. I find it hard to list the real sacrifices that those at the top of the heap have been asked to make since the recession set in around 2008. If we want to attack public debt," he says, "we need to see those at the top lead by example, not exception. And if we act as a united community as we did in World War II, we might even again learn that there are far more important things in life than money." End quote. Dave Armstrong, Dominion Post in Wellington, New Zealand. So, as I've tried to present the information, and this will set up Steve Ramirez for his presentation next, we've seen an incredible increase in wealth for the top 1% and a somewhat increase for the top 20% in wealth, and very much flatlining, in some cases decrease in wealth for those in the third, fourth, and bottom 20%. But at the same time, we've seen this massive increase in wealth for the top 1%. We've seen the top 1% receive tax cuts, and their highest earning percent of taxpayers has gone down. So that gives some credence to Armstrong's point about people who preach austerity rarely practice it. And I want to just conclude with a couple of thoughts. In my view, the financial market crisis of '08 revealed a deep-seated economic antagonism towards communities of color. There was a point in time, and this is clear in my racial coding article, where directly after September 28, 2008, March Madness, what did you call it, Christian? The September Madness of 2008, where I was flummoxed to watch pundits and politicians come out and say, wow, we wouldn't be in this mess if it weren't for black and brown borrowers, getting mortgages that they couldn't pay back. It was stunning that there was some sort of sense of blaming minorities for an economic global meltdown. So not only do we have sort of the impact falling most harshly on them, we even tried to scapegoat minorities in the quick aftermath of the financial market crisis, which I just find deplorable. So here we have a financial market crisis revealing a deep-seated, in my view, antagonism towards women of color and communities of color. When faced with the bleakest economic crisis since the Great Depression, white, male, primarily Wall Street executives and bankers are not held responsible in any meaningful way for their recklessness. Instead, African American and Latino female heads of households are forced to answer for the sins of corporate executive recklessness and duplicity. Today, with austerity on the lips of many citizens, how will sequestration and spending cuts impact minority Americans? I believe, and I've tried to present, that it will impact them harshly. Like the impact of the financial market crisis, minority workers and families, I predict, will feel the brunt of the spending cuts, including loss of federal jobs, loss of federal benefits, and significantly more so than white communities. When consequences are visited upon those least responsible for economic crises, in order to prop up powerfully entrenched and those most responsible for economic downturns, we stand at a serious underappreciated crossroads. Thank you.